so far and where we're going. Last week, David talked about an overview of survey error, questionnaire design, and designing factual questions, and he talked through the stages of processing questions and coming up with answers and dealing with comprehending the question that's being asked and retrieving the information from your memory and techniques to aid in that retrieval process, and how respondents come up with their answers to questions, and then how they map those judgments onto the response categories that are provided to them. And as I said, today we'll be talking about attitudinal questions. And then on Thursday, David will talk about measuring sensitive topics. And then next week, we'll talk about how to lay out questionnaires, how to design actually self-administered and interviewer-administered surveys. And then finally, we'll end next Thursday by talking through pre-testing and evaluation techniques. So today we'll talk about what attitudinal questions are and techniques for how to improve the measurement of attitudes. And really one of the key defining factors of attitudinal questions is that there are no right or wrong answers. There's no objective standard to evaluate your answers against when you're asking attitudinal questions. There's really no direct way to know about people's subjective states other than what they tell us when they answer our questions. And so how do we write these questions to make sure that we are getting people's true subjective states and their real feelings about topics? And really what we try to do is follow the same kinds of standards that David talked about last week with factual questions. We want to make sure that the questions are understood consistently by all respondents so that they're all answering the same question. And we want to make sure that they understand the response task all in the same way so that they respond consistently and that they are able to provide meaningful information about what they have to say about that topic. So it's kind of the big picture. Same goals here, making sure that we're asking questions in a way that people can answer consistently. There's three components of attitudes that we often ask questions about. The first being the cognitive component in terms of people's beliefs about a topic. What do they know about the topic? What are their feelings about the world around them? And the second area is the affective component, or people's feelings about a topic. What are their emotions? How strongly do they feel, and why do they feel that way about that topic? And the third is an action component, and what are they planning to do about that? How likely are they to vote? How likely are they to change their behaviors about the topic, etc.? So we really try to measure all three of those things when we're writing attitudinal questions. And here's an example of how we might tap into all three of those dimensions when asking about a topic like gun control. So the cognitive component, again, the people's beliefs about the topic, might ask about how much they know about efforts to place restrictions on who can buy a gun. Whereas the affective component might ask them about how they feel about the topic. Do you favor or oppose efforts to place restrictions on who can buy a gun? And then the action component, getting at their behavioral intentions, might find out how likely they themselves are to buy a gun. So when we're writing attitudinal questions, the first thing we think about is what is the attitude object? What is the thing that we are trying to collect attitudes about? And sometimes that's easier said than done to define what your attitude object is. So here's some straightforward examples. What do you think is the ideal number of children for a family to have? The attitude object being the number of children that families should have, ideally. Another example might be, do you favor or oppose allowing people to end their own life if they have a disease that cannot be cured? And again, the attitude object is how people feel about end-of-life issues. We want these attitude objects to be as specific as possible. But sometimes attitude objects can be difficult, vague, or abstract, and really can't be answered with a single question. So here's an example of where the attitude object is trying to tap into the role of moral values in how people decided who to vote for. And when this survey probed to find out what people were thinking about when they answered this question about moral values, less than half of the people were thinking about the candidate's position on social issues. And then all the others, more than half of them, were thinking about personal qualities, the candidate's religion, the candidate's values. So while you might think my attitude object is the role of values in this election, values is actually a pretty confusing concept that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it probably merits asking multiple questions on this topic. So this next slide shows some examples of how you might tap into an attitude object with multiple questions and then combine your data together to really try to understand the attitude on the subject matter. So in this example, the attitude objects are people's opinions about women in the workplace. And there's 4 items here. And the first one is tapping into women in the workplace in terms of how it affects the woman's relationship with her children. Can a woman who works have the same kind of warm and secure relationship with her children as a mother who does not work? And in the second aspect of assessing women in the workplace, it has to do with the husband. Should the wife be helping her husband's career? Is that more important than having a career herself? And the third area is what is the impact on the child and the young child, and is this child going to suffer if the mother goes back to work? And then finally, the last dimension of this is about the woman's role in the home. And it's better for everyone in the home if the man is the one achieving the income outside of the home and the woman's taking care of the home and the family. So you can see with this attitude object, it really cannot be defined by a single question, and it's better to measure it on multiple dimensions. So what we're going to do today is to talk through 10 key considerations in attitude measurement. I'm going to go through these very briefly right now, and then we'll dig into each one more carefully. So the first issue is writing balanced questions that present both sides of the issue. And this is a really fundamental aspect of writing good attitudinal questions. The second one is avoiding double-barreled questions where your questions are addressing multiple concepts all together in the same question. The third is being aware of the order in which you ask the questions, that the order can sometimes impact the answers that you get. The fourth is considering whether you want to offer an explicit option for don't know, or whether you want to offer a middle response choice and how that impacts the answers that you get. The fifth is thinking about scales and how long do you want your response scales to be. And the sixth is how do you label those scales? Do you label all of the scale points or only the end points or only some of the points? The seventh area is looking at unipolar versus bipolar scales and on what dimension do you design those scales. And eighth, again, still thinking about scales, making sure that the scale matches the construct that you're actually trying to measure. And then we'll talk about sources of error in designing questions and scales, dealing with acquiescence bias, social desirability bias, primacy and recency, and satisficing. And finally, we'll start to talk about the mode of data collection in design decisions, and then we'll continue talking through that next week when we look at how we design and lay out questionnaires. So first, let's talk about balanced questions. Again, I think this is one of the most important things that we consider when we're writing attitudinal questions, and we want to provide wording that addresses both sides of the issue. We want to make it clear that a negative response is just as legitimate as an affirmative response. And over the years, I have seen plenty of questions that ask something like, do you favor the death penalty for persons convicted of murder? And so you're not giving people the option of what's the other side of the coin here. Maybe I don't favor this, but I'm not comfortable telling you that I don't favor it, so I'm just going to say that I favor it. So what we really like to do instead is to present, again, both sides of the issue, and that could very simply be saying, do you favor or oppose the death penalty for persons convicted of murder? And another way of thinking about this is maybe showing both sides of the issue in a simple manner and then asking, what do you think? So some people think that the death penalty should be used for persons convicted of murder, and other people think that the penalty should not be used for persons convicted of murder. What do you think? So it's a fairly simple way of presenting both sides of the issue without getting too deeply into what the issues are around that topic. Another way of balancing questions is through counter arguments, where you might actually give them the reasons for taking both the positive and the negative opinions. So in our death penalty example, some people think that the death penalty should be used for persons convicted of murder, and other people think the justice system should not punish murder by committing the same act. What do you think? Now, the problem with the counter-argument approach is that the counter-argument that you select might actually not be the reason why people disagree with this area, with this topic. So in this example, it might be that people disagree with the idea of the death penalty because they've seen that it's not actually that effective at changing future criminals' behaviors. Sorry, do you mind muting your phone?
I can't. Darby, I can't mute it since you haven't made me host that thing. So.
Oh, I think you are the host, David. You should be able to.
By you. Okay.
Give it a try. So, or it might be that they disagree because they think the death penalty is cruel punishment. So again, you just have to use caution in the counter argument that you select, because then you might end up with people not knowing how to answer the question because the reason you've given is not actually the reason why they disagree with this. And they don't agree with it, but they don't disagree with the reason that you've given. So they're kind of stuck. So here's an example that was done a while ago, but I think it's still very relevant. It's about abortion. And they tested 3 different ways of asking the question. The first way was an unbalanced question. Do you feel a woman should be allowed to have an abortion in the early months of pregnancy if she wants one? So here you see only really presenting one side of the issue. In the balanced approach, they offered the alternative, or do you feel this should not be allowed? And then in the counter argument was, or do you feel a woman should not be allowed to end the life of an unborn child? So let's see how the data turned out on this. And what it showed was that there was very little difference between the unbalanced option and the balanced question. 68% agreed versus 66% agreeing when you presented the balanced perspective. But when they presented the counter argument, the percent agreeing dropped to 61%. So there were a number of people who decided to go with the counter argument when it was presented to them. So the researchers, Schumann and Presser, conclude that it really doesn't make that much of a difference data-wise to balance the question, but it's generally a good idea to present the other side of the issue when you're asking these questions. Again, adding the counter-argument can result in a shift of opinions, but it could be that it's appealing to different types of people. What they also found in the research is that the people who lacked well-formed opinions were especially susceptible to counter-arguments. So they might not really have thought very much about this issue, but when you give people a reason to oppose something, they will take it if you give them a decent reason for it. So I thought we could maybe work a little bit together on trying to improve some questions. I think you all got the slides already, so you can see what my suggestions are for improving these questions. But for this first one, I said, can people get the AIDS virus from mosquito bites? And so, this is an opinion question. you're really only presenting the one side of the issue. And so a simple way to improve that question might be, can people get the AIDS virus from mosquito bites? Or do mosquitoes not carry the virus? And so that would give people, a way of expressing themselves that they don't think people can get the AIDS virus from mosquito bites. Another example might be, if a member of your family got infected with HIV, would you want it to remain a secret or not? So one of my concerns that I've seen a lot over the years in the way people write survey questions is the idea of presenting the other side of the issue by just putting or not at the end of the question. I don't think that's the best way to present both sides of the issue, by just saying or not. So what I prefer is to really present something that explains to the respondent what it means if you don't agree with the argument. So what I suggest here is, if a member of your family got infected with HIV, would you want it to remain a secret, or would you want others to know? I'm sure you can think of other ways to make these questions even better, and they're really just meant to sort of drive home the point of how you can effectively balance out your questions. So let's move on to the second issue, which is double-barreled questions. And double-barreled question is really a question in which two or more opinions are joined together, and you're asking about multiple concepts at the same time. For example, this question here, do you think we should continue to use tax money to support arts and language programs in public schools? The problem, as you could probably see in this kind of question, is that we're asking about two different things at once. We're asking about the support of arts programs, and we're asking about the support of language programs. And it could very well be that there are taxpayers that think that we should be supporting language programs in the schools, but they don't particularly think it's a good idea to support arts programs in the schools. And so what we try to look for when we're assessing survey questions is the use of the word "and." And when you see the word "and" in your question, it's often a hint that there are multiple constructs being asked about at once. So this question would be better split into two separate questions to ask if they would favor or oppose using tax money to support arts programs, and a separate question asking if they would favor or oppose using tax money to support language programs. Now, Tron, I believe you had sent me a number of questionnaires that were currently being fielded in Vietnam. And so I reviewed those questionnaires, and I did find one that I thought could potentially be double-barreled. There was a question that asked, how satisfied are you with staff being open-minded and welcoming? So again, my trigger was use of the word "and" in that question. And it struck me that, at least in American culture, the way people interpret these two terms is very different from each other. That the staff could be very welcoming. They greet you with a smile. They're happy to see you. They ask you how you're feeling. But then when you start talking to them about your issues or concerns, they're not particularly open-minded in helping you figure out how to deal with those concerns. So I think those are measuring two different constructs. And sometimes you don't really need to measure the two things separately. You're really, as it turns out, maybe only more interested in whether the staff are welcoming. And so you can still just ask it in one question, but make sure that you take out the part of the question that's making it double-barreled. So there's different ways of dealing with these double-barreled questions, but we just want you to be aware of the risk of asking about two different constructs at once. Some double-barreled questions might be less obvious than simply using the word "and." So here's one that asks, would you favor or oppose a law that would permit a woman to go to a doctor to end pregnancy at any time during the first 3 months? So this is actually probably a multi-barreled question because if you oppose this, there might be a lot of different reasons why you're opposing it. It might be because you don't think that it should be law. You don't think that a woman should be able to end the pregnancy at all, or perhaps you think she shouldn't be allowed to end the pregnancy during the first 2 months as opposed to the first 3 months. So in a way, it's asking about a lot of different things at once, and we'd want to deconstruct that kind of question and probably split it into multiple questions. Okay, the next area that we're going to talk about are question order effects. And this is a big concern in questionnaire design, the idea being that responses to previous questions might impact responses to later questions. And this could be potentially serious if your question results you find out are a function of the order in which the questions have been asked. And this is particularly a concern in trend surveys or in questionnaires where maybe multiple different organizations are asking the same question, but the the questions that precede that common question are different. This was a particularly important issue in some research that I did at Gallup. Over 4 years, we were trending the attitudes of people in Iraq about the American occupation of Iraq and how things were potentially returning to normal in that country. And after a couple of years, the budget started declining, and the client needed to start rotating questions on their trend surveys. And sure enough, we found that we would get different answers to our questions when different questions preceded in that rotational design the question that we were interested in. And we had to make sure that we were always asking the core questions in the exact same order each month, and that the rotational items would come later on in the survey so that we would not affect those trends. Another big issue where this came up was in the American elections this past year for president, and different polling organizations were getting very different answers for who people were likely to vote for in the elections. And as it turned out, some of that reason for differences was because of the questions that were preceding the question of who you were going to vote for in that election. And the answers would change depending on what you asked immediately preceding that question. So it's a very big concern with very big implications in the field. So here's an example of what can happen when you ask a general question before a specific question, or a specific question before a general question. So here, again, thinking about abortion. Do you think it should be possible for a pregnant woman to obtain a legal abortion if she's married and does not want any more children? And a specific version of that would be, should she be able to get an abortion if there's a strong chance of a birth defect in the baby? See here is that you get a very different answer if that general question is asked first or if that general question is asked second, dropping by more than 10 points if the general question is asked second. There's another very famous experiment that was done asking people the general question of, taken all together, how would you say things are these days? How happy are you these days? Followed by a specific question of, taken all things together, how would you describe your marriage? How happy is your marriage? And the research found that, again, when you ask a general question first, you get a much higher answer to that general question than if you ask the general question second. So how happy is your life? Oh, it's really happy. How happy is your marriage? Versus how happy is your marriage? And then how happy is your life? So again, this underscores the power of these context effects and really paying attention to the order in which you're asking the questions and how they might be impacting subsequent questions. There's some other types of order effects that occur that you should be aware of if you're not already. The first is called rapport effects. And this has to do with what goes on at the beginning of the survey. And at the beginning of responding to a survey, particularly an interviewer-administered survey, there's a high degree of nervousness, uncertainty. What is this relationship going to be like? Who is this stranger standing in my doorway or calling me on the phone? And how truthful do I want to be to this person, and what kinds of questions are they going to ask me? And so we recommend starting your questionnaire with easy, low anxiety questions that are not going to make the respondent feel uncomfortable. And if you start your questionnaire with pretty sensitive questions, you may see a different answer to those sensitive questions than if those questions came later in the questionnaire once the respondent is more relaxed. Likewise, there are fatigue effects that can occur at the end of the survey because respondents are getting tired of responding, answering these questions, and they start giving less thought to their response. And I put in here the tipping points may vary by mode. When I worked at Gallup, they had an 18-minute rule for telephone surveys that you could not administer a telephone survey in the field whose average length was more than 18 minutes because they had evidence that after those 18 minutes, respondents start getting tired and they start paying less attention and not giving us thoughtful responses to questions. And the thought is that the tolerance for length of questionnaire is longer when there's an in-person interviewer in your home. They're willing to participate in a longer survey and have more energy for the survey when the interviewer is there to motivate them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we talk through designing these questionnaires for modes. So design implications. In order to reduce context effects and order effects, you can use transitions, introductions, conditional clauses to instruct the respondent, to help them stay on task, to help them focus on what you really want them to be answering about. So you might have a series of items and then end with this general question. And if you're going to do it that way, you'd want to say something like, including all of the things we just asked you about, overall, how happy are you? So they're taking everything into account as they answer that general question. But in general, the literature suggests that it's better to ask your questions going from general to specific rather than specific to general. And then also it can help to put some space between closely related items. So rather than asking all of your questions about the same topic at once, you might scatter them throughout your survey to try to minimize those context effects of the question that they were just answering impacting how they answer the very next question. Okay, let's move on to our area 4, which is offering whether or not to offer explicit don't know response options. So the example here, would you say the government is doing a good job or a bad job at controlling inflation, or aren't you sure? So what is the impact of adding that clause at the end of the question, or aren't you sure? When that extra clause is added, the research shows that it will substantially increase the proportion who give a don't know response. And the other side of the coin is if you don't include that don't know option, people might end up providing an opinion about something that they really don't know very much about. So you need to decide when you're writing your questions, what is it that you're after? Do you want to be measuring the proportion of your population that truly doesn't have an opinion and is uninformed about the topic, or do you really want people to provide a substantive response, and even if they're not entirely sure what their opinion is, you want them to still provide you with an opinion? So here's an experiment that was done where respondents were asked about an actual bill, the Agricultural Act of 1978, but one that very few people actually knew about. And so what they found was when they did not offer the explicit don't know option, they just asked people, do you favor or oppose the Agricultural Act of 1978? They actually had about 30% of respondents who had an opinion about this. Whether or not they guessed their opinion or actually knew what the act was and provided an opinion, it was surprising that so many people did give a substantive response, but fully 70% said they didn't know. When they tested it with an explicit don't know option, do you favor or oppose the Agricultural Act of 1978 or don't you know, that don't know option jumped up to about 90%. And what they saw was, particularly among lower education respondents, the jump between the don't know response for the standard versus the filtered jumped from about 57% up to about 90%. So that showed that people with less education are far more likely to select the don't know option when it's offered than to volunteer it when it's not offered, meaning that they're more likely to be sort of guessing what their response should be. So again, we want to just be able to really think about what we're looking for. Are we trying to go for an informed opinion, or do we not want to? Do we want to allow people that opportunity to say that they don't know? In general, the tendency is to not include that explicit don't know option, again, unless you really want to know the legitimacy of that response. It gives you a larger effective sample size with legitimate data for the options that you're presenting, and it does not drop the lower educated population who are more likely to select that don't know response. What we'll often do in interviewer-administered surveys is probe on don't know options. And if you give people, is this a good idea or a bad idea, and they volunteer, I don't know, we might follow up and ask them, well, if you had to guess, or if you had to share an opinion, what would you say? Would it be a good idea or a bad idea? And in that way, the respondent learns that providing a don't know response is undesirable because you really can't use that data in your analysis. We also like to think about whether a middle choice should be offered in the question. And an example might be a question that's asking, is something better or worse? And do you offer the response option of about the same? So what the research finds is that when the middle option is offered, again, just like the don't know response, it will significantly change your results. And it actually tends to pull from both sides rather than pulling from the people who actually don't have an opinion at all. The research also shows that it really doesn't seem to matter whether that middle response option is presented in the middle of the scale or at the end of the scale. For example, is such and such better, about the same, or worse? Or is it better, worse, or about the same? You get about the same percentage saying about the same, depending, regardless of where that response option is placed. And I also wanted to point out that sometimes that middle response choice isn't actually the middle response choice. We used to ask a lot of questions about the U.S. Postal Service, and when people go to a post office, how long do they have to wait in line? And generally, the response wouldn't be that my wait was very fast or that I had no wait at all. We would just present them with, was the wait reasonable or was it too long? And so do you explicitly present them with the option of the wait being fast, or do you just allow people to volunteer that response? So here's an example, again, from the literature, asking about penalties for using marijuana. Should the penalties for using marijuana be more strict or less strict? And in the experimental condition, they were offered about the same. And if you look, you see, again, a large bump in the percent saying about the same when that response option is offered, much larger than when it's not offered. And you can see it's pulling from both the people who say more as well as the people who say less, and not so much from the people who say don't know. So arguments in favor of offering the middle condition, it helps you refine the measure. It distinguishes a third category, which may be a very legitimate response in people's minds. And arguments against the middle position is that many people who don't have an opinion about the topic will just end up putting themselves in that middle condition. So this issue is really not settled among survey methodologists. And some people suggest if you really don't have a substantive interest in that middle position, then don't offer it, and you might be better served by offering more than just the two extreme positions, by saying, is something much better, somewhat worse, or much worse, rather than giving them that about the same category. And you allow them to, put themselves on one end of the scale, and not just in the middle where you don't really understand what their perspective is. Okay, so that segues us very nicely into talking about the length of scales. There's been a lot of research done on what is the ideal number of scale points to offer in a question. And really what it comes down to is, what are you trying to measure in your question? What is the purpose of your question? And it may be that you really only need two, or a dichotomous scale. Again, a Gallup example. Some of you may be familiar with Gallup's World Poll. They asked the same questions in, I think, 160 or 170 countries of the world. And they made a decision when Gallup launched the World Poll that every single question on that survey would only have 2 scale points on it. And their reasoning there, even though scales might have been more appropriate for many of the questions on that survey, was because it was a cross-cultural survey. They wanted to make sure that everybody would understand the questions in the exact same way. And in some cultures, the notion of a scale or dimensions of opinion would be much more challenging for respondents than in other countries. And so they ended up, again, with a dichotomous 2-point scale on every question on that survey. But more scale points really do offer more discrimination, and I think in many ways that instrument suffers because they don't have any discrimination of opinions by only offering the 2-point scales. On the higher end of things, the research shows that lengthy scales are really not that useful and can be difficult for respondents to answer. The general consensus is that about 5 to 7 points on a scale seem to work fine. And on the phone, you might consider even shorter scales, 3 to 4 scale points, or something called unfolding, where you ask people on a shorter scale what their opinion is, and you follow up with a question to ask about the intensity of that opinion. So there's some good research by John Krosnick that shows that for a bipolar scale, we'll talk about in a minute, the ideal length is between 5 and 7, and for a unipolar scale, the ideal length is 4 to 7. And again, we'll turn to those concepts in just a few minutes. So I wanted to just show you some examples of what scales might look like at different lengths of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 points. A 2-point scale, very simply, might be, do you favor or oppose? A 3-point example might be, how much do you do something? Do you do it a lot, some, or none, or not at all? And I'll point out that when I was doing research in Iraq, we tried using a 4-point scale for a question like this, how much do you? And we would say a lot, some, a little, or none. And our cultural expert told us that in the Iraqi culture, there's really no difference between the concept of some and a little. So we ended up collapsing it down to a 3-point scale. So you just need to be conscious, and this is true throughout any scale design, to make sure that your response will have a unique interpretation, a unique and consistent interpretation of each of the scale points. A 4-point example might be, how often do you do something? Do you do it usually, always, usually, sometimes, or never? And a 5-point scale, this is a very common scale that's used. Do you favor or oppose? To what extent do you favor or oppose? And you present strong opinion, the opinion, and then a neutral category of neither favor nor oppose. And you'll notice that I've ordered the scale from negative to positive. And when we start talking about acquiescence bias in a few minutes, I'll help explain why we tend to order our scales from negative to positive. And then finally, a 7-point scale might be designed like this, where only the endpoints of the scale are labeled, where 1 is very dissatisfied and 7 is very satisfied. I think the challenge of a 7-point scale, where you're trying to fully label it, again, is coming up with words that really are descriptive and unique from each other along that 7-point continuum. Well, here's an example of a 7-point scale that might be used in a telephone setting where you might use this unfolding technique that I talked about. This goes back to our earlier question about do you favor or oppose using tax money to support arts programs in public schools? This lengthy 7-point scale might be really hard for a respondent to process, particularly over the phone. It's a lot of scale points to listen to, and they might have difficulty recalling what all their options were. So we use an unfolding technique to simply ask, do you favor or oppose? And here you can see our neutral response option is in parentheses, which is suggesting that it's a volunteered option. You don't say it explicitly out loud, but you have a place to code it, since this is a telephone survey. And then you might follow that up by asking, well, you said that you favor this. Is that strongly favor, somewhat favor, or only slightly favor? And then you end up getting the differentiation between those three, and you can combine those two questions together to construct your full 7-point scale. Again, the challenge in my mind is, will people understand the difference between somewhat favor and slightly favor? So in this case, I tend to gravitate towards a 5-point scale rather than a 7-point scale. Okay, so this segues into our 6th area about how to label our scales. Under what circumstances do you label the endpoints versus fully labeling every point on the scale? And the driving factor, as I've been saying, is to be able to label your scale with words that are unique, mutually exclusive, and exhaustive. So unique being that your scale points, each one covers only a single concept. You're not measuring multiple things in your scale. For example, how satisfied and happy were you with your service, the service you received? No, you just measure satisfied. Your scale points should be mutually exclusive. They should not overlap with each other. And this is particularly a concern in factual items. When we ask how many times did you do something, I've seen way too many scales where the categories overlap. I did this 1 to 5 times, 5 to 10 times, 10 to 15 times. If you did it exactly 10 times, where do you put yourself on that scale? And then they should be exhaustive. They should cover all possibilities. David and I right now are writing a question about what time of day an incident occurred. And we want to make sure, even though it may be very rare that an incident occurred in the middle of the night, we want to make sure that there are scale points for every hour of the day. So here's a neat scale experiment that we did at Gallup several years ago. We were working with the U.S. Postal Service, and the Postal Service was unhappy with the scores they were getting. They thought the scores were too low. And we were asking their questions on this first scale, excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. And they wanted to see higher scales. They wanted to see higher ratings of their service and didn't understand why they kept getting such low scores. And they thought maybe it's because good is actually the middle of the scale. And for many customers of the Postal Service, good is fine. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for good service. And so they would give us 3 on this 5-point scale. But what the Postal Service really wanted was to get 4s and 5s on their ratings, not 3s. So they asked us to test different ways of asking this question. So we tested 9 different scales for them. You can see the first one, again, was what we had been asking in the past. The next 2 used a neutral category in the middle and played around with what the top 2 categories were. Was the top category excellent or was it very good? We tested a satisfaction scale. We tested partially labeled scales. We tested numerical scales. And then we tested an adaptation of the original scale where instead of using good for the middle category, we used neutral for the middle category. So here were the results. of the different scales. And you can see we got pretty different answers depending on which scale labeling we used. And the most positive responses, the highest mean score, came when we asked how satisfied they were with the service they had received from the Postal Service. And the lowest score was actually the original way that we were asking the question: excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor, which led evidence to their hypothesis that good is basically good enough for postal customers. When we replaced the good in scale 9 with a neutral, you can see those numbers popped up from 3.89 to 4.04, which was really exactly what we were thinking. And then when we changed the scale where excellent was no longer the top category, but very good was the top category, it went even higher to 4.27. So this just shows you the power of the labeling of the scales and how important those word choices are, and thinking carefully about the midpoint of your scale and what value people associate with that. So in summary, in terms of scale usage, in terms of using verbal scales versus numeric scales, the evidence is ambiguous, and the literature suggests that fully labeled scales are more reliable than partially or endpoint-only labeled scales. And in terms of the scale length, it seems from the literature that reliability increases with the number of scale points up to around 7. So you should try not to go above 7-point scales. Okay, let's move on to unit versus bipolar. And I talked about this briefly before. Unipolar are along the continuum, whereas bipolar scales are when you're presenting the opposite perspective. And these are really a matter of decision and how you want to design your scales. I often grapple with this likelihood scale that I have on here. What dimension am I trying to measure? Am I trying to measure the extent of likelihood, and maybe it's very likely, somewhat likely, not too likely, not likely at all? Or am I trying to measure the polar opposites? What percent are very likely to do something versus the percent that are very unlikely to do something? And you can see in the unipolar option, I only have 4 scale points there, whereas in the bipolar, I have 5 scale points. And so really, in all of this, I want you all to understand that scales should be designed to the question that you are trying to answer. And you should design your scale that's appropriate to that question that you're trying to answer. And sometimes it might be that bipolar opposite perspectives, and sometimes it might be that you're trying to measure things along a continuum. And I think this goes nicely into the next point, which is being sure that the scale matches the construct that you're trying to measure. All too often, I see people trying to force every question they want to ask onto an agree-disagree battery. That it's just easier to ask all your questions on the same 5-point scale of to what extent do you agree or disagree. And it's just not always the appropriate way to ask questions. This example here is not an agree-disagree, but this came out of one of the surveys that you had sent us. And it was an example of where I just felt like you weren't measuring the right construct for the content of what you're trying to measure here. So we're asking, how satisfied are you that the staff are friendly? And maybe it's a translation issue, but I felt like it could be a little bit better by asking, even if you were to ask, how satisfied were you with the friendliness of the staff? But even better, what I think you're trying to really get at is, how friendly are the staff? Are they very friendly, somewhat friendly, not very friendly, or not friendly at all? And so I just ask you to think about, when you're designing questionnaires, to make sure that those scales, that you're not trying to force everything to be along the same scale point for the ease of administration, because respondents get bored when they're being asked item after item on the same scale. And sometimes, again, those scales just don't match with what you're really trying to get at. Okay, let's move on now to, I've got 2 more topics. This is sources of error in scale design, and we'll talk about these 4 sources of error. And then I think we'll probably continue to talk about some of these in David's talk on Thursday. The first one is acquiescence bias, and this is people's tendency to want to agree rather than disagree. Respondents, particularly in an interviewer-administered setting, want to please the interviewer and maintain a pleasant interaction. So here's an example from Don Dillman that shows the exact same questions being asked on the phone versus on mail. And you see that respondents are much more likely to agree when there's an interviewer on the phone than when they're doing it self-administered. And these are more likely to happen in these agree-disagree batteries and yes-no questions and true-false items. People just don't want to, they tend not to want to disagree with things. And maybe it's a cultural thing as well. So what do we do about acquiescence? We want to ask very clear questions. Sometimes we want to reverse the logic. If we're doing a series of questions, we might word some of them where people's tendency is to agree and others where people's tendency is to disagree, to really help them understand it's okay to disagree with these questions. And ideally, we like to use forced choice questions where instead of this agree-disagree notion, we're again getting back to that balance, presenting both sides of the issue, and if you have to choose your opinion, which one of these comes closer to the way you feel about the issue. The next area is social desirability bias. And this is the idea that people give sort of socially acceptable responses, and particularly more so to an interviewer than in a self-administered survey. And this can arise with questions like asking about how much money you earn, how much do you weigh, do you use alcohol and drugs. This example here, how often do you drive a car after drinking alcoholic beverages? You can see right here that in a self-administered setting, people are much more likely to admit that even seldomly, they drive after they've been drinking. Whereas when they're asked this question by a telephone interviewer, they're much less likely to admit these sensitive behaviors. David will talk more about this on Thursday, I'm sure, but some of the things we can do to help with social desirability bias is to do a self-administered survey on particularly sensitive topics. And even if you are doing a face-to-face survey, you can hand the questionnaire over to the respondent or turn the computer over to them to answer particularly sensitive items. If you're doing a telephone survey with an interviewer, you can switch that questionnaire over to an interactive voice response or IVR survey for very sensitive items. But getting the locus of control away from the interviewer can help. And then I'll allow David on Thursday to talk through some of these other ways to address social desirability bias. The next area that can arise, source of error, are primacy and recency effects. So we talked about context effects, about the order of the questions impacting how people respond. Primacy and recency has to do with the order of the response options. The order of the scale can matter in how people process the information. Primacy effect, people tend to hear the first thing that you say or read the first few response options, and then they ignore what comes next. And we'll talk about in a minute this notion of satisficing, that people read the list until they see an answer that looks good enough, and they check that answer, and they don't even bother reading the rest of the list. So that can happen in self-administered surveys. And the other idea is the notion of recency, that if you're reading a lengthy list to people, let's say in an auditory or a telephone-based setting, people forget the first things that you said, and they only remember the later things that you said. And so how do you get people to really consider the entire set of scale options? So what do? We avoid lengthy response lists, or we try to. And that unfolding technique, again, can come in handy, where you ask things perhaps a little more generally, and then you probe deeper to get at the specific response. We'll also often rotate the order of our response choices. It might be switching the order of the going in forward order versus reverse order, or we might pick a random starting point on the list and cycle through and then go back to the beginning to finish out the list. And in a face-to-face setting, the use of show cards can really help. Rather than only relying on listening skills, the respondent can also see on the show card what those response choices are. And the last one we'll talk about is satisficing, that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Respondents often will choose an adequate answer rather than the optimal answer. And so they will tend to agree with the first thing that looks good to them rather than taking the time to consider all the alternatives. So here's an example in this study that presented a whole long list of things, qualities that were most desirable for a child to have. And you see the answers range really differ by the order in which they're asked. So we do want to be careful about this notion of satisficing. And what do we do about it? We try to avoid cues that encourage satisficing, like giving people the option, like we talked about before, of a no opinion or a don't know. And agree, disagree, that people want to agree with things, and they'll just take the easiest thing that comes up. What we'll also do, and we'll talk about this next week in the survey design module, we'll design our scales to go from negative to positive instead of positive to negative, to just make it the tiniest little bit harder, that you have to consider those negative responses before you just go with the easy answer of agreeing with something. And then really we try to encourage respondents to just think carefully about their answers before they provide them. Okay, the last thing for today is just getting us warmed up to thinking about mode effects. And the literature shows that a visual presentation, a self-administered survey, whether it's a paper survey or a web survey, that respondents' minds start to become cluttered after the first few options. Again, getting at this primacy effect, the satisficing effect. The first things on the list are more likely to be selected than later things on the list. And the opposite, like I was saying, under the auditory, like a telephone survey, the earlier options tend to be overwritten by the later options. The last few things that they hear are more likely to be the ones selected than the earlier things. And again, as I said, the fully labeled scales can be easier to process in the visual surveys, but fully labeled scales can be much harder to keep track of in the auditory surveys. So really we think about our mode of data collection and how can we design our questions, our response options, our scales to produce the least amount of error based on the mode in which we're collecting the data. And again, we'll talk more about that next week. So just to summarize for today, big picture, when we're asking subjective questions, we want to ask them in a way that people will consistently understand what we're asking and consistently understand the interpretation of the response choices on the scale. We want to really be aware of context effects. They can be a serious problem, especially if you're comparing results from one survey to another or results over time. You want to look at the entire questionnaire and how the question fit into the context of the survey. We recommend that you use don't know options sparingly. Do not use them often unless you're really trying to measure the percent of the population that truly does not have an opinion on that topic. We want to make sure that you're writing balanced questions that do not have biasing terms in them and that really try to present both sides of the issue. And finally, that you're designing scales that have an appropriate length and appropriate labels that people will understand. That's it for today. I hope this was helpful information for you. We will meet again on Thursday at the same time, and David will walk us through the issues surrounding sensitive questions. I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good night.
Okay, bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.